There are certain names in American history that seem almost too big to belong to ordinary people. Muhammad Ali was one of those names. Clint Eastwood was another. One became the most famous fighter on the planet, a man who could turn a boxing match into theater and a simple sentence into a headline. The other became the face of the quiet, dangerous Hollywood hero, the man who could say almost nothing and still dominate an entire screen. And then there was Johnny Carson. For decades, Carson sat behind the desk of The Tonight Show and welcomed some of the biggest personalities in America. Presidents, actors, musicians, athletes, comedians, and controversial figures all walked onto that famous stage. But there is one story that has circulated for years involving three legendary names: Muhammad Ali, Clint Eastwood, and Johnny Carson. According to the story, these three personalities came together for a television moment that supposedly became so tense that even Carson struggled to control what was happening. It sounds exactly like the kind of television event that would become legendary. Ali, the man who never backed down from a challenge. Eastwood, the Hollywood tough guy whose screen image was built on cold confidence. And Carson, the master interviewer, caught between two completely different versions of American masculinity. But there is a problem. When you look beyond the dramatic retellings and search through the documented history of The Tonight Show, the famous confrontation becomes much harder to prove. What we do know is that Muhammad Ali appeared on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show more than once. One documented appearance came on September 7, 1973, when Ali appeared alongside Ken Norton. Ali was already one of the biggest personalities in the world, and his appearance demonstrated exactly why he was so different from almost every other athlete who ever walked onto a late-night television stage. Ali didn't simply answer questions. He performed, he challenged the host, he challenged the audience. Sometimes he even seemed to challenge the entire idea of what television was supposed to be. Johnny Carson was famous for his calm style. He could sit quietly, raise an eyebrow, deliver a perfectly timed joke, and make the person across from him do most of the work. But Ali was almost the opposite. Ali didn't wait for the spotlight, he grabbed it. He had an extraordinary ability to transform a simple interview into an event. That is what makes the alleged Clint Eastwood story so believable to people who hear it. Because if there were ever two personalities who seemed destined for a television showdown, it would be Muhammad Ali and Clint Eastwood. Ali represented noise, movement, confidence, poetry, and confrontation. Eastwood represented silence, restraint, mystery, and controlled power. Ali could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention. Eastwood could walk into a room and make everyone wonder what he was thinking. Their public images could hardly have been more different. Muhammad Ali had built his reputation in the boxing ring, but his real weapon was never simply his right hand or his left hook. His greatest weapon was his personality. He understood the power of television long before most athletes did. He knew that a fighter who could make millions of people care about him before the bell rang had already won part of the battle. He gave himself nicknames, he predicted victories, he insulted opponents, he rhymed, he joked, he provoked, and sometimes he said things that made audiences uncomfortable. But Ali understood something extremely important. People weren't just watching Muhammad Ali fight, they were watching Muhammad Ali be Muhammad Ali. Clint Eastwood had taken an entirely different road to becoming an icon. He didn't need long speeches. He didn't need to explain himself. His characters often communicated through a stare, a pause, a slow turn of the head, or a few carefully chosen words. The man with no name became one of the defining figures of the Western genre, and later Eastwood's Dirty Harry character helped establish an even tougher image. To audiences, Clint Eastwood wasn't simply an actor playing tough characters. He became associated with toughness itself. That is why the supposed Tonight Show confrontation makes for such a powerful story. Imagine the stage. The lights are bright, the audience is waiting. Johnny Carson is behind his desk. Ali is sitting there with that familiar confidence. Eastwood is nearby, carrying the kind of quiet presence that made audiences immediately recognize him. Carson looks from one man to the other, and suddenly the conversation turns toward the question everyone would want answered: who is tougher? On the surface, it sounds like a simple late-night joke, but with Ali involved, simple questions rarely stayed simple. Ali had spent his entire career turning questions about toughness into opportunities. To him, toughness wasn't just about being able to punch someone. It was about courage. It was about standing alone. It was about refusing to surrender your identity when the world demanded that you change. Eastwood's screen characters represented another kind of toughness. The silent man who doesn't need approval. The man who remains calm while everyone else becomes emotional. The man who doesn't make empty threats because he doesn't need to. That contrast is exactly why the story continues to attract attention. But there is a difference between a story that perfectly fits the personalities involved and a story that can actually be verified. The dramatic versions circulating online often describe a specific televised confrontation between Ali and Eastwood, sometimes adding precise dates, enormous audience figures, detailed dialogue, and claims that Eastwood supposedly challenged Ali before leaving the stage speechless. Those details make the story sound convincing, but a dramatic story is not automatically a historical record. And this is where the real history becomes more interesting. Muhammad Ali genuinely was one of Johnny Carson's memorable guests. During his Tonight Show appearances, Ali could discuss boxing one moment and then completely surprise the audience with an unexpected subject the next. His September 1973 appearance is especially interesting because Ali spoke publicly about UFOs, a subject that caused laughter and disbelief among parts of the studio audience. The footage has survived, and modern viewers continue to debate the reaction Ali received. That moment tells us something important about Ali. He wasn't afraid to say something unusual simply because he knew people might laugh. That was part of his personality. He had already learned that public opinion could change. The same man who had once been celebrated as a boxing champion had also been heavily criticized for refusing military service during the Vietnam era. His boxing license and heavyweight title were taken away, and he spent years away from the ring during his physical prime. Yet he came back, and when he came back, he became even more famous. That history matters because when people imagine Ali sitting opposite another famous personality, they naturally expect fireworks. Ali had an almost supernatural ability to turn interviews into confrontations without necessarily throwing a punch. Now imagine putting that personality next to Clint Eastwood. Eastwood had a completely different relationship with fame. He rarely needed to dominate a conversation. His public persona was based on understatement. The less he appeared to say, the more powerful his image became. And that creates the perfect fictional television scenario. Ali talks, Eastwood watches, Carson smiles. The audience laughs. Ali makes another joke, Eastwood remains calm. Then Ali turns toward him. And suddenly the atmosphere changes. That is the scene that modern retellings love to imagine. But whether or not that specific scene ever happened, the cultural contrast between these two men is absolutely real. Ali was one of the greatest examples of a celebrity who understood that personality could become part of an athlete's legacy. Eastwood became one of the greatest examples of an actor whose restraint could become his trademark. One sold confidence through words, the other sold confidence through silence, and Johnny Carson was perhaps the perfect person to sit between those two worlds. Carson's genius was that he didn't have to overpower his guests. He allowed them to reveal themselves. Sometimes that meant letting a comedian tell jokes. Sometimes it meant allowing an actor to promote a movie. And sometimes it meant giving someone like Muhammad Ali enough room to completely take over the conversation. That's why Tonight Show footage from this era remains fascinating decades later. The television environment was different. There was no social media, there were no viral clips appearing seconds after a controversial statement. There was no YouTube algorithm waiting to turn a 10-second moment into millions of views. If something extraordinary happened on late-night television, viewers had to watch it when it aired or wait for a rerun. And that made the moments feel different. They were temporary, they were unpredictable. And when someone as unpredictable as Muhammad Ali appeared, nobody knew exactly where the conversation would go. That is also why stories about Ali and Carson continue to be rediscovered. A modern viewer can watch a clip from the 1970s and immediately notice something that audiences at the time may have taken for granted. Ali was not simply answering questions, he was creating moments. He understood television, he understood audiences, And most importantly, he understood himself. He knew exactly what kind of character the public expected him to be, and he knew when to embrace that image and when to break it. Clint Eastwood understood something similar, but in reverse. His strength was not in saying more. His strength was in saying less. That's why comparing the two is so fascinating. Imagine asking Ali, what makes a man tough? He might turn the question into a speech. Ask Eastwood the same question, and you might get a short answer. Perhaps a pause, perhaps a smile, perhaps nothing at all. And Carson would probably understand the comedy in that contrast immediately. That is the kind of television chemistry that doesn't need a physical confrontation. The personalities themselves create the conflict. Ali doesn't need to challenge Eastwood to a fight. Eastwood doesn't need to threaten Ali. Their reputations already do the fighting for them. The boxer versus the actor. The loud personality versus the quiet personality. The man who announces exactly what he is going to do versus the man who lets people discover what he can do. That is the real story. And perhaps that is why the supposed Carson showdown has survived even without reliable documentation, proving the famous confrontation actually occurred. It feels true. It sounds like something television producers would have loved. It fits the personalities perfectly. But history requires something more than a good story. It requires evidence. And when the available records document Ali's appearances on The Tonight Show, but do not establish the famous Ali Eastwood confrontation described in viral stories, the responsible thing is to separate the verified history from the legend. That doesn't make Ali's Tonight Show appearances any less fascinating. If anything, it makes them more fascinating. Because the real Ali didn't need a staged confrontation with Clint Eastwood to command attention. He could sit across from Johnny Carson and create unforgettable television all by himself. He could talk about boxing. He could talk about life. He could make jokes. He could surprise the audience. He could say something completely unexpected, and he could do all of it while millions of people watched. That was Muhammad Ali's gift. He understood that the fight didn't always happen inside the ring. Sometimes the fight was for attention. Sometimes it was for respect. Sometimes it was simply the fight to be heard. And Johnny Carson understood how to give people the space to show the world who they really were. As for Clint Eastwood, his legacy grew in a different direction. He became one of Hollywood's most enduring figures, eventually moving beyond acting into directing and producing. His career demonstrated that a person didn't need to constantly shout to become larger than life. Ali and Eastwood therefore represent two completely different versions of the American icon. Ali was explosive. Eastwood was controlled. Ali filled silence. Eastwood used silence. Ali made predictions. Eastwood made statements with a look. Ali wanted you to know exactly what he was thinking. Eastwood often made you wonder. And perhaps that is why people continue to imagine what would have happened if these two men had truly sat opposite each other on Johnny Carson's stage. Would Ali have tried to provoke him? Would Eastwood have ignored the challenge? Would Carson have turned the whole thing into a joke? Would the audience have erupted? Nobody can honestly answer those questions as historical facts without evidence. But we can understand why the fantasy is so powerful. Because Muhammad Ali and Clint Eastwood were more than famous men. They were symbols. Ali became a symbol of confidence, rebellion, athletic brilliance, and self-expression. Eastwood became a symbol of cinematic toughness, independence, and restraint. And Johnny Carson became the television host who could place personalities like these under one spotlight and simply watch what happened. The real lesson is that television history doesn't always need a dramatic fight to become unforgettable. Sometimes the most powerful moments are simply two completely different personalities sharing the same stage. Sometimes the legend grows larger than the footage. And sometimes, decades later, people remember a story because it feels like it should have happened. The supposed Muhammad Ali and Clint Eastwood showdown is one of those stories. The documented history gives us Muhammad Ali on Johnny Carson. The legend gives us Ali facing Clint Eastwood. And somewhere between those two lies the reason people are still fascinated by the idea. Because if there was ever a television stage capable of bringing together the biggest personalities of an entire generation, it was Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. And if there were ever two men whose personalities could make an audience wonder what would happen next, They were Muhammad Ali and Clint Eastwood. Ali didn't need to prove that he was larger than life. Eastwood didn't need to prove that he was tough. Carson didn't need to prove that he knew how to create television. They had already done all of that. The only thing left was the question that still survives decades later. What would have happened if Muhammad Ali and Clint Eastwood had truly faced each other across Johnny Carson's desk? Maybe someday another piece of archival footage will answer it. Maybe the story will remain exactly what it appears to be, a fascinating legend built from three enormous personalities. But one thing is certain, Muhammad Ali was already capable of turning a simple Tonight Show appearance into an unforgettable television moment. He didn't need a Hollywood showdown, he didn't need a script, he didn't need anyone to make him interesting. He simply walked onto the stage, sat down with Johnny Carson, opened his mouth, and became Muhammad Ali. And that was more than enough to make television history.